Hello and welcome back to the Better Brain Fitness Podcast. My name is Tommy Wood and I am joined as ever by my delectable co-host, Dr. Josh Turknett. Say hello, Josh.
Hi, Tommy. Quite tasty today.
So we are going to try for once to be on trend. So a little late, which is probably on trend for us.
Right.
And we're going to talk about the brand new dietary guidelines for Americans. I actually don't know what Josh thinks about these dietary guidelines, so I'm very excited to hear his thoughts. I will say that for me personally, and for most people who have commented on the dietary guidelines, they probably haven't read them all because they constitute a 10-page public-facing document, a 90-page scientific statement, and a 418-page appendix, which I have not fully read. I've just read expert digests of these things, and we'll put that caveat at the top.
Yeah, for sure.
Josh, take it away.
Okay. So yes, I'm going to focus on the highlights. I have not read the entire thing, but I think I'm going to focus on the things that people are actually going to hear about it, right?
Yeah.
And it actually would have been interesting for us to have tried to guess what each other would say about it. So, yes, these guidelines were recently released by the USDA and Department of Health and Human Services, and that included a new food pyramid. And these guidelines have generated a lot of attention on one side from those who celebrate these changes, and from another side who say they're an abomination. Honestly, I think if you look at them at face value, they probably generated a lot more controversy than is warranted. Of course, the reason is because we currently live in a world where everything is political. And even though you shouldn't be able to predict people's responses to nutritional recommendations based on their political ideology, that's where we find ourselves right now. But because there's so much controversy and confusion, and because diet and nutrition does matter to brain health and fitness quite a bit, we thought we'd offer our own little interpretation here. And there are definitely things that I personally take issue with when it comes to the guidelines, though it may not be along the lines of what you might think. So first of all, what are they? They actually replaced the prior guidelines, which was known as MyPlate, which was represented visually as a plate of food with different portions, with 4 different categories: proteins and vegetables and fruits and grains, I think were what they were. Here's a summary of the new guidelines. It comes from the USDA website, which is prioritize protein at every meal. Consume full-fat dairy with no added sugars, eat vegetables and fruits throughout the day, focusing on whole forms, incorporate healthy fats from foods such as meats, seafood, eggs, nuts, seeds, olives, and avocados, focus on whole grains while sharply reducing refined carbohydrates, limit highly processed foods, added sugars, and artificial additives, eat the right amount for you, based on age, sex, size, and activity level. Thanks for that. Choose water and unsweetened beverages to support hydration. Limit alcohol consumption for better overall health. And then visually, these are represented as an inverted pyramid, just like the South Park episode foretold. And I think that is not an accident. I think there's some symbolism in some ways, saying that the prior pyramid that we had was upside down or backwards. But when you get into the specifics, it's not, I think, as revolutionary as some have made it out to be. The previous guidelines also emphasize many of the same things, including eating whole foods, reducing refined carbs. I think I see it as 3 main differences. One is the role of meat and dairy. In the new guidelines, protein is prioritized more than it was before. And also in the prior guidelines, the MyPlate, lean meats and low-fat dairy were considered better sources. And in the new guidelines, there's not an emphasis on lean meats, and full-fat dairy is recommended as the source for dairy rather than low-fat. And it's just there's overall a prioritization of protein in general in a way that there wasn't in the prior guidelines. Grains are also de-emphasized. So in the MyPlate and in the food pyramid before, they were kind of a foundational component to the diet. And even on the MyPlate, occupied a little more space than protein. Now they're at the tip of the pyramid. So kind of the least amount recommended, and only in the form of whole grains. And then the kind of stance on added sugars has been strengthened a little bit. So the prior recommendations recommended limiting it to less than 10% of total daily calories. Now they say, no amount of added sugar is considered part of a healthy or nutritious diet. And they're recommending no more than 10 grams of added sugars per meal if you're consuming sugar at all. So again, not a lot there that's that groundbreaking. I think overall, the subtext here is that the prior guidelines were too harsh on animal foods, and saturated fat in particular was unfairly vilified, and that the prior guidelines were too easy on sugar and processed grains, both of which are somewhat defensible positions. My biggest problem with these guidelines is that they are forcing us to have the wrong debate, and this back and forth that will inevitably continue is counterproductive overall. And I think it's just a reflection of kind of the crudeness and imprecision in our public conversation about diet and nutrition. So I'm going to give my strong opinions on this topic as briefly as I can, but I think there are two big problems here with the guidelines. First is the concept itself. What I mean by that is that there is such a thing as a set of one-size-fits-all guidelines that can encompass, all of diet and nutrition. Because the reality is there is not any one-size-fits-all diet that is optimal for everyone in terms of promoting health and well-being. There are a few universals that apply to everyone. We all need protein to survive. We all need adequate amounts of micronutrients. There is no requirement for ultra-processed foods or refined sugars. They don't promote health and well-being. But there are also a great many factors that are going to be specific to an individual and not universal, including, the amount of carbohydrates that you can tolerate, and that will promote, optimum health and well-being, and that's going to depend on a whole host of factors. The fat composition of your diet is going to be contextual. Whether or not saturated fat is something to be concerned about is going to vary significantly from one person to another. The emphasis on animal versus plant foods. There are multiple issues where if you work with people, you find some do better on a diet that leans heavily towards animal foods, and you might find some instances where the opposite is true, and that may even change for a single individual all over the course of their life. There are things like meal timing. Does 3 meals a day work for everyone? No. Many can do better with a better approach. And I think if you are a clinician and you work with a lot of people and you're not dogmatic and you're just trying to find what works best, you will discover all these things. So the problem here is that these guidelines are presented as universals when they aren't. And this gets to a topic that we have talked about a good bit before, which is that so often in public health and in medicine, the recommendations that are being given at the population level, not at the individual level. So when you're seeing a recommendation, it's not always saying this is the best thing for you. It's saying this is the best thing for the population, meaning these and other kinds of guidelines are asking the question, what would be the best approach if every single person adopted this approach, right? And then that doesn't mean there could be plenty of people for whom it's not the right approach. It's just what is the best approach if this is what everybody does. But that isn't often explicitly stated, so it leads to a ton of confusion. The other problem with that is that that sort of population level guideline makes sense if you don't have any ability to predict individual variation or how individuals will respond to different approaches. So if we had no way to tell who would do better with a higher or low-carb diet or plants versus animals or whatever, then it would make sense to give a one-size-fits-all guideline. But the problem is we do have the ability and understanding of how to individualize, right? We've come a long way in this area. There are things we can measure. We can tailor this stuff to a person. And the problem is when you have these kind of one size fits all guidelines, it makes it harder for clinicians to do that kind of individualization and try to provide the best care for their patients. So it gets in the way of optimal care at the one-on-one level. So that's the issue with the concept itself. My second beef with it is that our entire nutritional classification system is archaic and absurd. And this is one of those things I think it's so ubiquitous that we kind of can't see how bonkers it is. But the categories and the terms that we use for food, specifically when talking about diet and nutrition, don't bear any relationship to their impact on human health. So we divide plant foods into fruits, grains, vegetables, and legumes, which are all botanical categories. So fruits are the seed-bearing plant or part of a flowering plant. Grains are the seed of a grass plant. Legumes are the seed-producing pod of a particular class of plants. And then vegetables are just any part of the plant that's not the seed or the fruit. And then even, animals versus plants. That's a zoological and botanical categorization. None of that was based on its relation to human health. So these were developed long before nutrition science, and now we're trying to shoehorn the science into those categories. So to give an analogy, imagine you were creating a car buying guide. The sensible thing, you might categorize them by class, like SUV or truck or car, or by fuel efficiency or handling, because those are all aspects, attributes of the cars that impact our experience of them as drivers. So those are the categories that matter. So using our current classification for nutrition, it would be like creating a guide where you organize it into the best red cars and the best blue cars and the best yellow cars, right? So categories that don't matter to you as a driver, or maybe by where they're manufactured. So Japanese versus German versus American. In that case, you might have some loose correlations with certain tendencies, but it's still not the thing you actually care about, and you end up grouping together items that have almost nothing in common while separating others that are nearly identical. So a German sports car is going to have more in common with a Japanese sports car than a German minivan. And that's what happens with food. A potato has more in common metabolically with white bread than with broccoli, right? But we group the potato and the broccoli together because they're both vegetables. So the categories don't tell you anything about what matters, and so you're using this categorization schema that's not connected to the thing that you care about. It's like if we were to try to relate all of modern neuroscience back to phrenology, right? We've updated our terms, and we need to update. We need to update the terms to reflect the new science. So the problem is that doesn't just create needless confusion. It also creates a lot of needless controversy, and we end up having these debates that I don't think we should have ever been having in the first place. I also don't think you ever had this level of politicization of it if we had used more sensible terms from the start or replaced them when the time came. So, for example, if you were kind of relating food back to human health, you might categorize it into processed versus whole foods, or protein dominant versus carb dominant foods, or liquids versus solids, or glycemic impact and so forth. And there are people trying to do this, but our current terminology is so entrenched that it is an uphill battle. But I think I hope is just for the sake of progress that eventually we move beyond this categorization systems, because I do think it causes more problems than people realize. So those are my two beefs with the guidelines in general. And so this is not just the present guidelines. This is the concept overall. I just don't like, and think it's oversimplified and sort of sends the wrong messages. So that's my take, Tommy. What do you think?
Thanks for that. I think super interesting and a different take than what I've seen in several places, and important that I think that what's in your food and what it does to your body matters a lot more than where it came from necessarily. And I think that also applies to levels of food processing, right? Because protein powder is a processed food, oat milk is a processed food, right? These are like baby formula is technically a processed food. Sometimes these things can be important and critical components of the diet that, because of the processing, actually you've improved the nutrient status, you've improved the more critical aspects, but you've done that through processing. And one example of this that I'll just mention now because I started talking about it is that one of the criticisms, which I think is a fair criticism, right? You previously, when in previous dietary guidelines, they focused on grains overall, but didn't specifically tell people to minimize processed grains. They just said eat whole grains, but they didn't sort of say don't eat processed grains. One of the reasons for that is because of folate fortification in processed grains, which is required. And I will say that there's a very nice breakdown of the whole dietary guidelines by Kevin Klatt on his Substack. He's I think it's Casey Klatt Substack is the name. He is a PhD dietitian. He's a faculty at UC Berkeley. He actually also wrote a very nice history of the American Dietary Guidelines for the annual reviews journals, which is a very prestigious journal. We'll link to those if anybody's like really interested in sort of like the nitty gritty here. But one of the things about folate specifically is that the average American will not eat enough folate if they don't eat processed grains. That is unfortunately a fact. And we've seen from data from NHANES, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, that after the fortification of processed grains in the US with folic acid, which started in 1998, significant elevations in homocysteine, so a homocysteine above 13, dramatically decreased in the US population. So it had a noticeable effect on something that we know is important for long-term brain health. Now, that doesn't mean that I think that everybody should go out and eat a whole bunch of processed grains, but you would then need to make sure that you're getting enough folate, leafy greens, beans and legumes, liver. And the problem is that the average American does not consume enough of these foods. And that's something that's also worth considering, because one of the issues that's worth thinking about is, what are these guidelines for? And in reality, the guidelines started in 1980 as quite simple, public facing, and I have them here from Kevin Klatt's Substack, so I'm just going to read them. There were 7 things: eat a variety of foods, maintain an ideal weight, avoid too much fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol, eat foods with adequate starch and fiber, avoid too much sugar, avoid too much sodium. If you drink alcohol, do so in moderation. Those are vague, but it's not bad advice, right? And it's also very similar to what we're hearing 45 years later, right? These things haven't really changed that much. But now what has changed a lot more is what the guidelines are used for. So they're not really meant to be public facing. So now we have like the new thing, realfood.gov, I think it is, that sort of like explains like eat real food, which is a useful, it's a useful rhetoric, right? You understand what that means. Right. Like if you say eat a healthy dietary pattern, which I say a lot actually, you spend a lot of time like figuring out what that actually means. And then what that means is, as much as possible, eat whole nutrient dense foods as much as you can. Right. So some of that framing is, I think, also defensible in this sort of a new switch. But the dietary guidelines aren't for the average person to figure out what they should eat. They are largely there to drive policy. Like they are there to help shape what can people get with food stamps. What do kids' school meals look like? That rather than what should each individual person be putting on their plate. And I think that's actually helpful, because right now, if you look at the pyramid and then you also look at the recommended servings and serving sizes, they don't match up. It doesn't actually make any sense. But that's also not really what the guidelines are for. So it's worth bearing in mind kind of just reiterating what you said, is that this is kind of like, this is public health stuff.
Right.
And if I were to make a decision about like, how do I maximize the health of the population if they were to eat a certain way, I would consider, say, if I can, at the population level, reducing LDL cholesterol or ApoB containing lipoproteins, because we know they contribute to cardiovascular disease. The one food that increases ApoB and LDL cholesterol the best is butter, right? So at the population level, I would say we probably should, consume less butter. That doesn't mean that you as an individual can't track your lipids and consider, how you respond to butter, because it's different from person to person.
Right.
And so we just need to bring that into context. So when you look at the new pyramid and like butter is smack bang in the middle of it, and it's right next to, I'm just going to make sure I've got it. Where did it go? Yeah, right. So butter is kind of in the middle of the pyramid. It's next to prawns and nuts. And grapes and oranges. Like, that doesn't make any sense. Equally, when you look at whole grains, and I would say like the My Plate was probably more useful from a visual perspective, right? We could discuss the different proportions, right? So it had it was in quarters. 1 quarter was grains, 1 quarter was protein, 1 quarter was fruits, 1 quarter was vegetables, right? Do I think your dinner needs to have grains every night? No, because you could have potatoes, right? If you wanted carbs. The protein source, right? If your protein is legumes, right? That's also a carb source, right? So you don't necessarily need to eat grains at the same time if you're trying to get a certain macronutrient balance. So there's some issues there. But here, whole grains is right at the point of the pyramid, like you said. But the actual guidelines say 2 to 4 servings of whole grains a day, which is the same as protein and other foods that are like at the base of the pyramid. Like, so it just doesn't like conceptually add up. And so I think one of the important takeaways that I've had from reading people who are really deep in these guidelines, like Kevin Klatt and Michael Easter also did quite a nice breakdown that was sort of very accessible on his Substack, is that if you actually read what the guidelines are, they're pretty sensible. A, they're pretty sensible, and B, they haven't really changed that much at all. A few other things that are worth considering is they've made the guidelines less specific. So previously, when you looked at protein foods, they recommended a certain amount of seafood per week. They no longer do that, which I think is unfortunate, because I think most people, if they can, should eat seafood. And if this is being used to figure out what people can get access to at the population level, right, I think on average, people should eat some seafood. So some of that's a little unfortunate. Some of the serving sizes don't really make sense. So 1 serving of protein is like 3 ounces of meat or 1 egg. But 3 ounces of meat has like 4 to 5 times as much protein as an egg does. Right. So some of that stuff just doesn't really add up. But I will say that I'm in favor of an increased focus on protein intake. The average American supposedly eats somewhere between 1 and 1.2 grams per kilo of protein per day. These are recommending a bit more, which I would agree with overall. Again, at the population level, if people can get access to this stuff, or and the important thing again to remember here is that most people are not like you and I, Josh. Unfortunately, right? They may not have the time, the money, the access to Whole Foods. But you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, no, I know.
Just because it's actually the average person cannot afford or get access to the type of food that you and I would hopefully be able to do that. And we have to remember that, because that is an important grounding in these guidelines. So when you're telling people not to eat highly processed foods, and it's also interesting that they use highly processed, because that's not a scientific classification. That's not a thing. And the reason they did that is because they couldn't come to an agreement on what ultra processed foods is, which is a scientific classification. So they say don't eat highly processed foods, but they don't tell you what highly processed foods are, because those aren't actually, they don't have a formal definition yet. So that's interesting. But those are the types of foods that the majority of Americans eat. Those are also the types of foods that are subsidized by government subsidies still, right? So corn, wheat, soy, these are subsidized, and then they end up being turned into ultra processed foods that, again, that's what's made accessible and affordable. And so there is a misalignment between where money is invested and what people are being told to eat, which is a big problem as well. But coming back to the protein, I do think on average people should eat more protein than is recommended by the RDA. Some people have said that, right, yeah, if you're eating more protein, you're more likely to overeat calories, especially if it's fatty meat. That's probably true, right? Most people don't need more burgers. That's on average, again, at the population level. And then they're worried that you focus on protein foods, you're going to have less fiber and other things. I think that all of these things are worth considering, but are not impossible to navigate. It just requires some like thought, which people may or may not be able to attend to, and that's another thing of this personalization that you were kind of mentioning. So there is a potential inconsistency in the guidelines where they say, right, focus on full fat dairy and meat, but then the guidelines also say consume less than 10% of your calories from saturated fat. And if most of your protein comes from fatty meat and full fat dairy, you are automatically going to be above that 10% from saturated fat.
Right.
Again, depending on the person, this may or may not be an issue, right? At the population level, it's you will like, if this happened, you would likely see a shift in LDL cholesterol and ApoB containing lipoproteins and associated cardiovascular risk. So just with that in mind, but you can do this very easily if you're focusing on lean cuts of meat, and I would say focusing more on lower fat dairy options. This is what I tend to do because that gives me the most flexibility in my diet. But again, those options are more expensive. But right, if you have 93-94% lean ground beef, or you have your steak is top sirloin, or other types of lean steak, you can easily get a significant amount of protein and keep your saturated fat below that cutoff. If you have lower fat dairy products, that's going to make it easier. Eggs give a gram or two of saturated fat per egg, so you could certainly include some eggs. So it is all doable, and I don't think it's bad advice. Right, I think people should consume more protein at the expense of more sort of like highly processed grains and added fats, because in general, those are the things that contribute to calories without contributing nutrients. But it does require some work, which not everybody and cost, which not everybody is able to do. So all of that kind of muddies the picture. I think I do agree with. So as you read the Highline guidelines at the top of the episode, and like I agree. Like
there's not a lot to take issue with. Right,
there's very little to take issue with, but it's worth just remembering that these guidelines are largely for policy.
Right.
We need to think about them in the context of the average American, which is not necessarily the way that the people who are arguing about this,
right?
That is not those people, right? And people have different amounts of access and ability to afford "quote unquote" real food, and that's where some of the pushback has come from. And I think that's fair, especially if this is being used to drive, food stamps and other things. So I'll steal another phrase from Kevin Clout, which is that these dietary guidelines are nothing burger with a focus on the burger. And so some sensible advice in there, especially if you read the actual guidelines, if you bear in mind what these guidelines are actually for. If you then really dig into it, there are some internal inconsistencies. There's maybe some advice that doesn't align with best practice for population health, stepping away from individual health. But most of it is sensible. It's just like the actual implementation is kind of tricky and requires nuance, and not all of it that quite aligns with what maybe most people would recommend. So those are my thoughts. Any thoughts on my thoughts or any follow-ups, Josh?
No, that's all. Those are all great points. I think that some of the inconsistencies and contradictions that we find in there when you're digging into some of the details probably come from, one, this was all partly to make a statement. These guidelines, that like there was a mix of motivations behind them, and so probably like the butter thing was probably somebody trying to make a statement about and then also the fact that these are made by committees, so like they were never able to find a compromise on some of these things, and so you just have one thing saying one thing and one thing saying another, and they contradict each other, and like they couldn't resolve that internally. And those, when you see that, it probably just tells you like these are things that are still kind of unsettled, right? And to your point too, I think that like if policy like would better align with these guidelines, we'd be in a better place, right? If like we let's make these foods less expensive and not and not the ones that we've all agreed are more harmful. Those probably shouldn't be the ones that we're making cheapest. So that would all be good things. So I think I agree with your added insights as well. We hopefully we didn't. I don't think we offended too many people with our take. We're
not doing it right.
So we won't blow our podcast up. But this is the problem, and this actually kind of fits with the theme of the guidelines. Is like nuance does not. It does not go viral, right? Nuance doesn't spread easily, so that's part of why this is less nuanced than it sometimes should be, and that's true of public health guidelines. That's kind of been an overall policy, because for a lot of reasons, but one reason is people start to tune out the more detail and the specifics that you give. So it's always a balance. But if we wanted this to blow up a lot more, we would have taken a much more definitive stance. All right, but I appreciate your take on it. And if you guys listening have any follow-up questions on this, feel free to leave a comment on our Substack, or if you have a question for us to consider on a future episode, send it our way. You can send us a note on Substack or a comment, or click the link on the podcast description, or go to brainjo.academy/questions and input it there. And we'll be happy to look at it and answer it for you. All right. Anything else, Tommy?
No, that's it. Thanks so much, everybody, for listening, and we'll see you next time.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.